Good morning, everybody. I'm Louis Baarda. I manage Farming Smarter's field-tested research program. And for those of you who aren't aware, that's where we take products, practices, technologies, ideas, um, and evaluate them on the field with field scale equipment in a real world context. So today I'll be sharing a little bit of what we did this summer in the field tested program. The presenter who was scheduled to take this time slot was unable to be here virtually and was unable to get a recording prepared in time. So I'm stepping in. I hope it's a fair replacement for everybody. So with that, I'll dive into a little bit about what field tested is, and then we can look at some of the research and some of the results from a few of this year's trials. So like I said, with the field tested program, we partner with farmers to conduct on-farm research. It's a pretty important piece in this progression, this process of research and innovation. And if we keep all of our research sort of in the lab in the small plot, sometimes it's hard to evaluate, what are the constraints to adopting successful technologies, or how do we need to adapt successful technologies or ideas for them to sort of fit that real life context. So the last couple of years, we've done about 20 on-farm trials on a variety of topics. Which I won't get into all the details there, but we're quite excited to see the program grow. We're quite excited to see the appetite among producers, to see things happen on the farm, and it's been actually quite exciting to see how some of the research that we've done that we feel we feel really good about what we've accomplished with the research, and then we still see that there's adaptation or changes or development that needs to happen in small ways to sort of facilitate that transition to use on the farm. So this is sort of one of the motifs for the field tested program and for Farming Smarter in general, is that innovation is not easy, and new ideas, like I said, they do need to be studied and adapted in the real world. So that's what we're here for. We've done a pile of different ideas, a bunch of different projects, technologies. Yeah, it's been a good process so far. So I'd like to share some of the progress and outcomes of three projects with you today. So I'll talk about flea beetles and neonics. I'll talk about our glyphosate-resistant kochia work, and then I'll talk a little bit about a couple of variable rate irrigation projects that are just starting to get some traction. So first, flea beetles and neonics. So this research project has its genesis in some of the work by the PMRA that suggested that perhaps we would lose the option of using neonic seed treatment as a control measure for flea beetles. Now, if you know much about flea beetles, they're a major pest for canola across the province, across the prairies actually, and our best control measure for them is that seed treatment insecticide. Now, canola seed is treated typically with and almost universally with a neonic seed treatment, and then you can also have the option of topping it up with a lumiderm treatment. But there's that lumiderm treatment on its own isn't terribly effective. In fact, it's more effective on the striped flea beetles, which is a species we see less of in southern Alberta and a lot more in northern Alberta, although that is changing over the last number of years. So we wanted to evaluate, some of the next best alternatives. If we did not have this seed treatment insecticide as a control option for flea beetles, what are our next best options and how well do they actually work? So this research sort of taps onto some of the research of Hector Carcamo with Ag Canada here in Lethbridge, and what he's done, and he's actually worked with us on these projects, is evaluated, how much boosting seed rate. So and found that to actually be a pretty effective control measure. So you may, for example, double your seed rate, and if you have untreated seed, all that extra plant matter, all those extra canolas actually act as a bit of a bait crop. So you thin out that double seed rate till it's about normal if you have high pressure, and the number of plants that actually make it to maturity sort of negates any yield loss. So that was one piece that we wanted to evaluate. So what we did was we looked at just our normal commercial seed, full treatment, Helix vibrans, so has Lumiderm as well as the neonic seed treatment. And we did that at a standard seed rate. Then we did a fungicide only seed. So that's sort of a no seed treatment insecticide. The fungicide is just sort of to make things comparable. So the seeds are treated with the insecticide and fungicide. We didn't want to leave something without that fungicide, just to make sure our treatments were comparable. So everything had the base fungicide, and then some of them, the commercial seed, had an additional insecticide piece onto it. So commercial seed, what you'd normally seed, seed without insecticide at the same seed rate, seed without insecticide at a double seed rate. And then the other factor we looked at was the foliar insecticide piece. So that was the second control measure that was really effective in Hector's trial. If you didn't have the seed treatment, then the foliar insecticide was actually effective. But depending on the insect pressure, it may require more than one application. So we did look at that as well. And what we ended up doing was we sprayed, half the trial was sprayed, half wasn't. And what was sprayed right around that 2-leaf stage, regardless of pressure. So when you're scouting for flea beetles, you're looking for that 25% damage on the cotyledons. So if that, whether it was at 10%, 60%, whatever it was, half the trial got sprayed at that stage. So just diving into the data, and I'm not going to have the opportunity to go through everything, but one thing that I thought was quite interesting here was the the distribution of striped and crucifer flea beetles. So here we have our southern Alberta data. So we did 4 fields in southern Alberta over the last 2 years, and then 4 fields up in Peace Country over the last 2 years, and then we did 2 trials in each field. So we have a pretty robust data set, and we put out those sticky traps. I flashed through that a little bit earlier, just to be able to get that species composition. And over 90%, so it looks like about 92, 93% of the flea beetles that we found here in southern Alberta were the crucifer flea beetles, whereas in northern Alberta, here's our slide for northern Alberta. It is apparently not properly labeled, but this should say northern Alberta. So in northern Alberta, we actually had 80% were the striped flea beetles. So it'll be interesting to see how how everything sort of pans out when you have the different species, because they do tend to appear and feed at different times. They do have different susceptibility to different chemicals. So we may see a bit of a difference. And of course, there's some weather effects as well. So, but this is sort of what we expect: a lot more striped in the north and a lot more crucifer in the south. But if I just go back a slide, talking to Hector, and I don't know the timeline off the top of my head, but say 10 years ago, at a certain point in his career, finding a striped flea beetle here in southern Alberta was a big deal. But now that mix, even though it's highly tilted towards the crucifer, that mix is becoming more and more balanced over the years. And we did see, 10%, just about 10%. In some fields, it was over 10%. That's a big change from the past. And it means that our strategies for managing flea beetles are going to need to have a little more nuance moving forward, because it is now, because they have different behaviors, different susceptibilities, we're going to need to start using a more dynamic approach. So that's maybe a bit of an aside to this, but certainly something to keep in mind. So this is sort of our fleeting damage. And from here on out, I'm just sharing data from our southern Alberta fields, because it's sort of more relevant to who's down here. And yeah, I just thought that was kind of just where I'm at with this. So flea beetle damage, again, as I mentioned, we're looking for that 25% threshold. So when you're scouting for flea beetles, as soon as you get above 25%, that's when, economically, it makes the most sense to initiate a foliar insecticide or a control measure. So we have our untreated seed. So maybe we'll look at our commercial seed first. Our commercial seed, and then the thatched side is the what did receive insecticide, and then the solid color is what did not receive insecticide. So commercial seed with that seed treatment insecticide, without a doubt, effective. Kept damage below 5%. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And then that's not uniform. In fact, we know that sometimes with that seed treatment, we do need to initiate control measures, but wow, that did a good job. So it's a pretty effective tool. So that's kind of the thing that jumps out the most. And then if we look at the damage levels, so this was recorded after that first foliar insecticide, so after that 2-leaf stage, and both our untreated seed at the high seed rate and our untreated seed at a normal seed rate, we're at about 30% damage. So without that seed treatment insecticide, both would have required foliar insecticide. Whereas when foliar insecticide was applied, it did keep those damage levels below the threshold at which we'd see a yield effect later on. So to summarize that piece quickly, basically, it looks to me that with this piece of the data is suggesting that the commercial seed, one, is very effective, and two, may prevent the need for foliar insecticides on top. So there's control measures, looks to me are going to be likely, certainly when pressures are high, but the commercial seed reduces the need for that seed treatment insecticide. And I should mention that there have been a few changes to that. We started this trial, we applied for it about 3 years ago, and that's when there was a lot of buzz about the potential for restrictions or losing sort of that neonicotinoid option as a control measure. And I think there's ongoing evaluation of it, but for now, there's sort of limits and restrictions on its use. So restricting rates, restricting number of applications, encouraging more PPE use and other safety precautions for users of it. So I think it doesn't seem imminent that this option would be gone, but certainly something we want to keep in mind. So the next piece here is the yield. And again, doesn't look like there's big differences in this, but right off the bat, I would say, the commercial seed yielded about 1,300 kilograms a hectare. The untreated seed at the high seed rate yielded about the same, without the foliar insecticide. So that's sort of echoing exactly what we expected to see based on some of Hector's work. So it looks like an effective strategy as far as maintaining yield. Is it cost effective? That might be a different story. But the untreated seed, we lost about 200 kilograms a hectare in potential yield. So again, this is sort of before stats have been applied to it, but this is the story that we're expecting to see, certainly based on our small plot research outcomes. And then across all three treatments, the foliar insecticide did provide a yield advantage, even on the commercial seed. I'm not sure that this will end up being a statistical difference, so keep that in mind, but certainly there's some potential there. So I mean, to summarize the neonic piece, the commercial seed treatment is highly effective. It reduces the need for foliar insecticide, and the foliar insecticide is also effective in protecting yields, especially when there is no seed treatment insecticide. Second project I'd like to share a little bit about was our glyphosate-resistant kochia trial. This is something where we're working with Dr. Charles Geddes, also with Ag Canada, and we're looking at patch management of kochia. So kochia tends to grow in patches and fields, especially where there is marginal land, saline land, low competitiveness. In many cases, oil well sites, a lot of these, there's certain characteristics of fields that lend themselves to kochia getting established. I'll start on this one. I've got a video. This will be your escape from the indoors. I've got a video of one of the field sites that I visited this summer. So I'll start with that, and then we'll go into a little bit of how things went this year.
Hi everybody, this is Louis Baarda here. We're standing in a durum wheat field in southern Alberta, south of Bow Island. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about our glyphosate-resistant kochia project. So what we've been doing for this project is we've selected a few fields here in southern Alberta that have major issues with kochia. And we've been working in the same field year after year, trying to use targeted control measures using precision agriculture and whatever tools we have to combat resistant kochia. So if you look behind me, obviously we do have some major issues with kochia in this field. Kochia tends to manifest itself in patches, and that's why it lends itself quite well to site-specific or targeted controls. So if we look kind of in this area, we're standing in a piece of the field. It's an irrigated field, but we're standing in the dry corner here. So this is sort of where the crop is less competitive. If we pan over a little bit more, we'll start to see some bare ground. There's also some salinity here, and that's exactly where kochia likes to thrive. So these plants, they're salt tolerant, they're resistant to drought, and when there's no competition, that's when they really thrive. So we're in 2021 right now. It's been an extremely hot, extremely dry year. And we're seeing, not just here, but across southern Alberta, the kochia really has been competitive. I'm seeing fields all over. I've seen kochia like I haven't seen over the course of this project. So this is what we want to deal with. We want to attack, these patches and get rid of them, with precision ag. So what we've done this year, we're using herbicides that can help us target kochia, and we're applying them where they need to be applied. So in this field, there are areas where there's just crop, there's areas where there's kochia patches. So what we've done is we've taken a drone, a UAV, we've flown it over the field right around this timing, so we can identify where the kochia is, where the seeds are likely to land, and then either this fall or next spring we'll apply an appropriate herbicide. In this case, because Authority is now registered for spring wheat and durum wheat at a lower rate than maybe you would use for peas, we've applied that where we think kochia is going to come up, and we've seen some efficacy there. So in some of the saline areas of this field, the corners and the edges of the field, there's a canal along the edge, so there's a bit of saline seep. And that's where the kochia really is getting established in this field, our biggest patches. So one thing we tried this year was to seed a salt-tolerant forage, but it really didn't take off. And one of the things that was challenging in this particular instance is that this field is for seed production, so that limited our options for a forage mix or a salt-tolerant mix. We couldn't have anything that was going to head out or be any cereals that would sort of contaminate our seed production because we wouldn't have proper isolation. And because of that, that limited our ability to use Authority with our salt-tolerant mix. So just one of those unique pieces. In each of the fields we work with, there's unique challenges, unique solutions, but we're trying to use everything in the tool belt to sort of combat this kochia. The risk for kochia comes not only from in the field that we're standing in, but also kochia can come in from neighboring areas. So anywhere, often non-agricultural land that isn't properly maintained. In this case, we have a field across the road that also has some issues with managing kochia. So that becomes a risk for this field as well, because those kochias can mature, break off, tumble into this field, and regardless of whatever work is done here, that poses a risk for future populations of kochia. So even when we do a good job of managing things in our area, it's sort of a community effort. We need to sort of work together, with the neighbors, with municipalities. Oil well sites are also a big risk, power poles, all these things, and we're seeing in our fields that that's definitely a risk for establishing a patch and a seed bed that can spread into the field. We're here, it's late August. This field will be harvested probably fairly soon. It's quite mature. So as we harvest the field, a lot of these patches of quite mature kochia. So this kochia is, past the point where herbicide is really going to be effective unless we're using extreme rates or extreme scenarios with it. But cutting it is going to help manage these seeds. So the seeds on these kochia plants are probably a month or so away from all being mature. So we don't really have a good idea when the seeds are viable, but you know, October, we know they're for sure viable. Probably getting into September, we're starting to be at risk of the seeds being viable. So we're going to want to be controlling these plants as soon as we can. So if we're harvesting the field soon, they'll get cut down by the combine or the swather, and that'll help to manage things. But in some of these field edges, if we don't manage those while we're harvesting the field, we may want to come in with some extra control measures. So cutting, tillage, you know, kind of whatever works to sort of damage the plants so they're no longer viable, so those seeds aren't adding to the seed bed for next year.
So that's a I guess I have to congratulate myself. That's a pretty good summary of the project, a pretty good summary of the kochia issue. So I'll maybe just move into a little bit of what we're doing with this. I had mentioned that this time of year, shown in the picture here, when the crop is senesced and the kochia is still green, is the perfect opportunity to collect imagery, whether it's drone or perhaps satellite, if you have the proper resolution. So that's what we've done. We've flown drones. It's a little bit different time depending on the crop, depending on when the crop turns color. But when that kochia is really popping, really green against the rest of the crop, we can identify exactly where those patches are. We can look at them year to year, see how they change. And when we know where those patches are, we can initiate control measures, targeted control measures in those areas of the field. And those control measures could be anything from a particular herbicide. It could identify where we might want to start planting a salt tolerant forage. It may mean that's where we're going to look at doing some cutting, but knowing where the problem is, and you know, in the case of this satellite image I'm showing now, you know, how concentrated it is. So there's a lot of interesting pieces there. So this is the outcome, just on a plain background, the outcome of what we had in year one. And this was following a year we had spring wheat. It was the first year of the trial. This was before we had opportunity to take any targeted control measures. So there's a significant saline area along the east side, the right-hand side of the field. And in fact, in some parts of that saline area, there's too many salts for even kochia. But as that salt dissipates, the levels go down into the field, you get high concentrations of kochia there. And we did some ground truthing to verify that that was the case, that what we saw with the imagery was actually happening in the field. Year two, that field went from spring wheat into faba beans, which gave us the option of using authority, which is a really effective control measure. It's an irrigated site, so we did get that activation. In fact, what happened in this field was edge was applied, I believe, for the majority of the field, and then authority in that high risk area. So that was an opportunity to not apply all these chemicals in every part of the field, but to sort of target control where there was a problem. And it was actually quite effective. And we found throughout the course of this project how important rotation is in managing kochia. It's not just herbicide, but it's you know, what herbicide options do you have? And authority is a really good one, certainly on irrigation. But again, there's certainly risks when you get to a dry land environment, especially, you know, following a year like this year where it was so hot, so dry, you may not get the activation. And in fact, in pivot corn at one of our sites, we didn't get proper activation of authority, and those kochias sure grew. So this was year two. Year three, it's a 4-year project, so we still have 1 year to go. I haven't yet had the opportunity to go and I guess analyze the data, but this is the image that we will analyze. And I will turn annotations on here a second. You know, so I can see that there's pretty heavy, we had flax in this field this year, applied with edge. pretty heavy kochia populations. I can see already now that there's quite a bit of green in, in some of these risk areas that I'm highlighting here. So, and this is what we saw. Certainly in two of our sites, we saw it really felt like a step backwards. So, you get a different year, a different climatic situation, and all of a sudden you're taking a big step backwards, which was kind of tough to go through in a way, because we've really focused, really tried to sort of continue to navigate this kochia piece. If I clear all of those, you can see there's a bit of a line here, and this is where we went in to try to establish a salt tolerant forage. So if I clear that line, you can see where there's more kochia. The weed pressure's a little bit heavier on the left side of that line where we didn't apply that, try to apply that, establish that forage. But I mean, from being in the field and looking at it, we had very little success establishing that forage this year. Whether the salinity was just too high, whether we came in too late, there's a logistical piece there as well. It's tough to prioritize, establish anything in those marginal lands, and by the time you get there, you're already a little bit behind. You're getting to hot days. So yeah, so that was wasn't as effective as we had hoped. But again, I think we're developing tools that we can use. We're developing methods that we can target those areas of the field, especially in a location like this where the whole west half, the left half of the field has hardly any issues, but you've got high concentration somewhere else. It probably makes the most sense to manage that problem variably, even if it's manage one part, not manage the other part, and identifying exactly where you need to manage the first step. And then after that, choosing a proper control method, whether it's a variable rate herbicide prescription, or maybe that variable rate herbicide is combined with, planting something that's maybe a little salt tolerant, higher seed rates perhaps. So there's a few different ways we can go, but step one is sort of identifying where that is. And we're finding that the best option for control is going to change depending on the year, depending on the crop, and even just depending on management practices, time and labor constraints. So it is complicated, but given the growth of resistance in kochia, I do think it's pretty important. It's very important to start zeroing in on some better practices to manage it. Finally, I'd like to share a little bit about a couple of variable rate irrigation projects that we're working on this year. So we initiated two projects in 2021. One was with a company called IntelliRain, who came to us and said, hey, we'd like to work with you to evaluate our technology and develop it on the field in farmers pivots. So we set up two pivots with their system this year, and we'll do another two next year and evaluate how well they work. And the other project is with a group out of the University of British Columbia, and they have a bit of a different system. So the first system installs their proprietary variable rate technology. They're dealing with sensors mounted on the top of the pivot that can measure soil moisture throughout the field. And then the second one is in-soil moisture sensors, and that one will use existing variable rate pivots and develop algorithms and prescriptions to properly apply variable rates of water throughout the field. So again, I've got a quick video of how far we got on one of our IntelliRain installations here at Farming Smarter this summer.
Okay, it's Louis Baarda here. I manage the field tested program for Farming Smarter, and this is one of the interesting, innovative projects that we're working on this year. We're working with IntelliRain, and they're a company that they're developing a pretty new, pretty novel technology for variable rate irrigation. And we've got the pivot behind us here. It's actually been a pretty long year for this project, with a lot of production of electronic parts being slowed down. It was a real challenge getting everything that was needed to finish off, the hardware and the software components for this trial. But finally, here it is. First week of October, water shut off in a couple of weeks, and we've got a fully functioning VRI system in our pivot across the road from Farming Smarter. So as you sort of pay attention behind me, you'll see these banks of sprinklers will be shutting off and on as it's irrigating. And what the pivot's doing right now is each pivot span has a tower on top of it, a little scanner that just scans back and forth, and is measuring and modeling and predicting how much water is presently in the soil, and then watering according to what capacity we'd like to see in the soil. So at this point, basically the pivot speed is set, so there's a set rate, and then we put a percentage of that rate down based on what's happening in the soil. And as we move forward with this project, that pivot will be able to vary the speed as well to adjust rates. So this is just kind of the first stage, but quite excited to see, you know, it responding to what's happening in the soil right now. We're in a bit of a low spot, a depression, where the soil moisture typically is a little higher. So you know, typically wouldn't need that full rate of water. So that's why you're seeing quite a few of the sprinklers turning off behind me. So yeah, pretty exciting to kind of see this technology in action. And you know, we believe there's some real opportunity here to reduce the amount of water we're using, reduce the amount of energy we're using to get the water on the field, and possibly increase the amount of land that we can grow crops in every year. Thinking about some of those low spots, those problem spots in fields that some years could reduce your acreage by a certain amount if it's wet, and if it's dry, they still need the water. And this is something that can autonomously do that for you. So again, kind of in the beta testing stage, should be ready to, you know, fully implement this from day one next season in a few fields in southern Alberta. So stay tuned, and we'll continue to update you on progress with this project.
So yeah, it's been a process actually getting to this point. You can see that we're doing fall irrigation. We took we filmed this piece of video, I think in September, middle of September, close right before water was going to be shut off. So it took some time, and you know, it's one of those technologies where there's so many moving parts, so many pieces, that you're taking on a lot by trying to get the system working properly, and getting all the pieces communicating with each other. So yeah, anyways, was quite excited to get to this point, and I think there's some real potential to use the technology in ways that can benefit producers. You know, to start, well, maximizing land area. So any of those marginal lands that get overwatered, well, hopefully we can shrink those. Maybe we can boost yields. Maybe we can reduce disease incidence by applying less water. Thinking of a crop like dry beans, perhaps, you know, keep that surface wetness down, boost pollination by not irrigating over V-tents. But that's a lot of exciting things that's you know, that's a few steps away from where we are right now. Right now we're at the point of, certainly with this system, just trying to make sure everything can communicate with each other, making sure the model is effective. This is an autonomous model that continues to learn. So with every circle the pivot makes of the field, it better understands how that field behaves. You know, when you apply an inch of water, what happens here, what happens here, what happens here, what happens here. The model learns that and can adapt and change according to that, which is great in theory, but in practice, you know, that's why we're here, to evaluate it, to see how well it works, and to see what we need to do to further develop it. So yeah, so that's been pretty exciting. Here's just our partners at UBC did a little bit of background work on our site here in Farming Smarter, just to demonstrate, you know, how variable some of the parameters in our own site actually can be across the field. And you know, our clay percentage goes from 20 to over 40, close to 50% clay throughout the field. So elevation is actually quite variable as well. So, you know, just in a quarter section, you know, the water needs do change. And this is based on some input data, they developed a water holding capacity index for the field. And again, you know, you can see certain areas are able to hold a lot more water than other areas. And yeah, so just an illustration of one field and how variable it is, and the opportunity to benefit our crops, benefit our water use by applying it variably. Some of this technology, variable rate technology certainly isn't new. There's a lot of models out there, a lot of hardware out there for it. But in a lot of my conversations with producers, it's really, really tough to manage it. To input prescriptions, change prescriptions throughout the season. And in fact, there's so much else going on. It's really tough to sort of have a dynamic irrigation model. So it ends up being a static model. And in some cases, there's two prescriptions you choose: one when it's dry, one when it's wet. And the wet one turns off sprinklers in the low spots. The dry one just maxes out everything the whole time. So we also, I don't think, have a whole lot on variable speed. The pivot goes that same speed around the field, but we do have the computational capacity to identify the best route, so to speak. So where do you speed up, where do you slow down, and what risks do you take by slowing down when the other side of the field is drying out because it's 30 degrees and a 60-kilometer wind. So again, these are probably more long-term things. I think step one now is just to make the darn thing work properly. And yeah, I felt like we made some progress there this year. So we'll see what next year brings. With that, yeah, I just wanted to say I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to share some of what we did with Field Tested this year. As I mentioned off the top, I'm always excited to get into some of these new ideas. Always excited to be standing next to a tractor out in the fields, with the sun on my face. Yeah, I do get tired of sitting in the office for most of the winter. So I'm excited for what's next. And if anybody does have any questions, I'd love to hear them.
I think we're getting most people back into our platform here. If you are just joining us, we're going to get underway with our question and answer session with Louis Baarda. And again, thanks to Louis for putting together his presentation on short notice with all the great research work he's done throughout the year to help us out. And if you're new to Farming Smarter, Louis is a familiar face around the Farming Smarter organization as the on-farm research authority. Of course, a real expert on data collection, working with farmers, doing some research very scientifically, but on a field scale on the farmers and on the farms. And so he's been sharing some of the details of some of the projects that they've been involved with this year, including, of course, some kosher research, and that's a hot topic. And Louis, we've already had a couple of questions coming in about the use of authority on your wheat rather than flax. Do you want to talk a little bit about the use of that product for kosher control?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess a couple of things on that. Yeah, so I did comment in the chat there. Of course, it's going to depend on your rotation, right? So with any of these herbicides, especially sort of the soil active ones, you're going to want to think about what your next few years are going to look like and when it maybe makes most sense to deploy that. So that would be one factor. And in this case, what we did with the authority in that Durham field was apply it where the kosher pressure was strong enough to require that control. So, in the field corners in those saline areas, all based on that drone imagery. So it wasn't a blanket rate. It was sort of that targeted application where the risk for kosher getting established was the highest.
So that's the reasoning behind that choice. Yeah. Okay. So again, if you have questions, you can just type them in the chat. Either use the put your hand up, raise your hand option under, of course, the way the reactions there, you could raise your hand, or just type in a note that you've got a question and we'll go right to you. So, Louis, the irrigation project that you're working on, a lot more government dollars invested in irrigation lately, and yet, of course, there's always pressure on water, especially when drought is on our minds and has been. Do you think that there's going to be, more pressure in the future to use our water especially wisely with irrigation and looking at things that more targeted application like your variable rate work?
Yeah, I suspect we'll definitely move in that direction. I think some of the easy wins, maybe not the easy wins, but the more impactful practices might be just pipelines instead of canals, like those kind of broader things, and sort of that delivery system. There's a lot of opportunities to be more efficient with water, but there's a lot of irrigated fields out there that have issues with and where there's opportunity to vary the water application to increase land area to boost crop production. I think there's farmers out there that are doing a mechanical or an analog variable rate irrigation by turning off valves over low spots. So this is something that, yeah, like I said, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do a better job on it. But the real challenge is just getting the technology to work the way we'd like it to work. And we've seen in our work this year that it's not as simple as you might think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There does have some complications, and that's just because of the very nature of it being so broad. Is that kind of what led to the complications, or was it more in the actual technology?
Yeah, I think it's both. It was a tough year to start. As anybody who's tried to purchase anything this year knows, all sorts of parts and electronics have been tough to come by. So that was a challenge. But I think it's one of those technologies where, in theory, it works great, but when you bring it out to the field, there's all sorts of hurdles and barriers to making things work properly. We've got some computing piece where we're trying to develop an algorithm or a model that says here's how you irrigate, where you irrigate it. There's also getting each of the valves on the sprinklers to understand what to do. There's that communication piece, sort of wireless communication. So yeah, there's just a lot of steps to it, and you can look at it from the outside and say, well, just do these 12 steps. But when you actually have to get in there and go through those steps, there's always wrinkles and challenges. And in fact, it took us until October, late September, to be able to actually apply variable rate irrigation the way we kind of wanted to. And we still have to continue to develop that model so it makes sense.
Part of that probably would be sort of the opening year research, if any kind of project. But is that one a 2 or 3 year term, or how long do you have to sort of
Yeah, so in this case, so we do have two projects. So next year we'll have 5 years, or sorry, 5 fields with variable rate projects going on in them. So I think if we can use this year as a launching point, next year is sort of, that's the year when we get out there, see how the control works, and actually get to the point of evaluating what's happening in the soil. So yeah, so kind of optimistic for that, but I do expect it's, again, probably not going to go as smoothly as we hope.
Okay, so just a reminder, if you have any questions for Lewis, you can just type them in the chat and we'll send them his way. Or if you prefer to ask in person, just either send me a quick note or use the raise your hand function, and we'll be happy to pass your questions along to Lewis. Lewis, it was interesting to hear Jerry's talk about working with farmers on a smaller scale basis and doing research over in the UK. I mean, in essence, that's kind of what you've been doing, but are you maybe, a little bit bigger scale and providing some of that structure for farmers to sort of measure their actual results?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities to what we're both trying to do, and yeah, it's such an important step to understanding how technologies work is getting on the farm and seeing how they go. And as far as the scale of our trials, sometimes they might be a full quarter section, especially that kochia project exactly is what it is. It's something the spatial variability of kochia in the field and how to handle it. That's something that you can't really evaluate sort of in a reduced scale. Whereas the flea beetle project, that was something that we applied that in a couple of acres on a section of the field, because we do want to do some intensive data collection, and to scale that down just made a lot of sense. So there's there's not really a standard in my experience for how to take, ideas and technologies to the farm and understand how they work in that sort of open environment. We sort of have to be pliable and adaptable and work with our producers and some of the things that are important to them, just to find that right methodology to help us reach our goals.
Mm. All right, Chris is asking, are you spending any time seeing when the kochia are germinating in the resistance project? Are you focusing at all on when they're germinating?
Not exactly. I mean, it does factor in. So ideally, when we designed this project, what we hoped we could do was use some of the soil active herbicides, perhaps even spray, so authority, as I'd mentioned, perhaps even apply it in the fall. So you do get that moisture activation, so that in the spring you have that opportunity to have that control right off the bat. So that's sort of how we framed building that project. But you're right, that timing of germination is a key thing, and it actually can be quite variable with kochia as well. So our control measures, we're sort of trying to target them for something that's going to make sense for the farmer, a timing that they're going to be out there, a timing that that they would reasonably do, that doesn't take them away from other things.
All right, Rob is asking about the fact of whether UBC or others doing the correlation of sensor to actual soil moisture.
Yeah, Rob, that's the step we're taking this next year. So so the Intellerine project, we're sort of just at the point where we're actually doing the variable application. The UBC project is a little bit different, where they're going to tap into an existing variable rate system and develop autonomously develop models. So that's going to be a big part of what we do this next summer on those fields, is get out there, frequently to measure and evaluate what's happening in the soil. Are our models effective? Are we watering the way we should? Is it putting water down at the rates we expect? And are we keeping soil moisture sort of in that acceptable level according to the crop that's being grown?
So not overdoing or underdoing on any actual place, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks, great to see this work, Rob says so.
Thanks, Rob.
All right, any further questions? Any surprises? I mean, I know you always have to be sensitive to what nature is, or the research is actually telling you. So were there any, but yet you still sort of have some expectations, any surprises on any of these three projects that you've kind of been working on? And I know it's in early days, but any things that have really popped up that you're wondering, okay, is that really the way it is, or is that just what we're seeing in this first year?
Yeah, I don't know about surprises, but whenever we work with something, again, in that open environment, and we're dealing with pests that we maybe can't predict how they're going to behave, so flea beetle can, the pressure or the presence can be quite variable from year to year, from field to field. So we never really know what we're going to get there. So it's always interesting to kind of get in and look and say, okay, there was this much damage in this location, but this location there was way less. And the kochia too, it's you don't always have that control, especially when you get into such a hot, dry year as this year. That has a big impact on some of the outcomes that we see. So we can put in, in this case, what we thought was going to be a pretty effective control measure, but when it's hot and it's dry and we don't get that activation of the herbicides, that moisture activation in those dry corners, then it almost feels like we're taking a bit of a step back, and that's kind of part of the process, and why it's worth being out in the field and doing this stuff, because that's what farmers are dealing with as well, is a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, you're testing it under extreme conditions, which is probably a good thing in some cases. So is kochia one of those weeds that excels in drought conditions, or does it beat back kochia a little bit naturally as well?
No, kochia loves heat, and it loves it loves it when there's no competition. So when the crops around it, if you seed other crops, if they're not being competitive, then the kochia just grows. And this year was a really, really tough year for kochia.
And then that has implications for the next year because it just reproduces more.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Any other questions coming in on either of on any of those projects? Now, are you at sort of midstream on? You mentioned the variable rate irrigation one is new, but are you midstream on the others, or were they all sort of new projects this past
Yeah.
season?
The flea beetle one, that's we'll be wrapping that one up this year, and our kochia project, where that was year 3, so we've got 1 more year left to go. So those ones are sort of getting to the tail end. So the kochia project, we've got an opportunity to get out there and try a few different control measures in our last year. So yeah, that'll be fun. And then the variable rate irrigation, we're in year 1 of 2, but we're hoping that we can sort of, depending on how successful we are with getting the technology to work this year, we're hoping we can sort of roll that into the next steps of actually looking on some possible, I guess, ancillary benefits of the technology. So things like being able to reduce the surface wetness of the soil by irrigating properly, and maybe reducing risk for molds in crops like dry beans. So yeah, so kind of all different stages for each of these projects.
One of the speakers this morning talked about how, finding some answers often leads to more questions. And so, like, even with the kochia one, as you wrap it up, were there things that, you found that will require further study? I mean, or have we got kochia kind of figured out now?
Well, yeah, that kochia project, it's I think there's just a lot of real world elements to it where it's it's really hard for us to do a study like that and come up with, like, this is exactly what you should do to manage kochia. We're testing a bunch of different things, and we're trying to integrate them with management systems for different producers. So and a big thing we're learning there is even just crop rotation is a big tool. So what crop do you have? How competitive is it? What kind of herbicide options do you have with that crop? And because rotation plays a big part into it, the management strategies are going to change from producer to producer. So yeah, I guess it's tough to say this is the thing to do, but we're sort of learning different ways we can sort of be adaptable, different tools that we can use under different scenarios, and yeah, hopefully moving in the right direction.
Okay, well, thanks for your update on those projects. Appreciate knowing where they're at and keeping tabs on them for future years as well. So that's Louis Baarda. And again, you can always reach Louis through Farming Smarter. And again, we encourage you to become a smart subscriber, because then you're getting regular research updates. And as you see, our QR code is up now for Louis's session. And so you can get your credits for tuning into this session. So thank you very much, Louis, for putting that together.